flashes like that because it's changing servers.
Yeah.
So, um, Michael, welcome to my family.
Yes, thank you very much. It's good to be here.
And the family is actually the Pali word for it would be Sangha.
Mm.
And that you probably know that the word Sangha is referred to as part of the triple gem, the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha.
Mm.
Well, in Asia, the teachings of the Buddha were spread by the Sangha, but in the West, it was spread into the West by scholars, theologians, most specifically Alan Watts,
Mm.
and others, um, translators, people who actually were spreading Buddhism against their own will, using words like bowing and scraping and having the general population become familiar with it. And so, in that regard, the real teaching of the Buddha didn't come in to the West. That, in fact, why it's not even widespread in Thailand. That most of the people in Thailand are ordinary people who practice a religion, an ordinary religion. Now, Bhikkhu Buddhadasa talks about Buddha Sasana, and that he is looking at it from a different angle than I am because he has only lived in Thailand. I don't think, other than going to India uh, and hanging out in Bodh Gaya and Krishnagara, etc. Um, he's not familiar with Christianity as it's practiced. He certainly read the Bible, but he
Mm.
hasn't been around Christians. The only Christians that he's been around are people who come to him,
Mm-hmm.
which means they're not really Christians at all, real Christians. You know, they'd rather be racist Republicans voting for Trump and trying to take over the world.
Right.
That's what Christianity is. And that's, in fact, the same kind of mentality as the Catholics back in the Middle Ages,
Mm.
with crusades and inquisitions and witch burnings and all of this kind of stuff. It's ordinary people. And so um, Bhikkhu Buddhadasa uses the word Buddhasasana uh, with the word that's commonly translated, the Thai word sasana actually means community, but it's been translated into religion, to the word religion.
Right.
So um, basically, what had happened was is that the teaching of the Buddha from the very beginning in the early days found enemies. There were enemies of the Buddha. Why? Because he was cutting into their paycheck. People who would listen to the Buddha would stop having rituals done by the Brahmins.
Right.
Now, the Brahmins, in fact, in several times in Indian history, have amassed huge amounts of land. In the time of the Buddha, in fact, they owned almost all the land, except when a king or an invader would come in and upset the social order. And then the Brahmins would get right back to work of taking all the land back.
Mm.
And how they did it was by performing funerals.
Right.
That the cost of a funeral in India historically has been everything you own.
I see.
And that what was left was divided among the families. That's why the big estates in India have gotten smaller and smaller and smaller to the point that the people can't even farm their own land.
Mm.
But in the time of the Buddha, the Brahmins owned almost all the land. More than once in history, they have owned almost all the land. That, in fact, just as a side point, there is the Burning Hats in Varanasi. to where it's still, the story is that if you become cremated by the Brahmins doing a special ceremony at the burning hats, then you're sure to have a better next life. But it's
Right.
going to cost you all you own.
Right.
When I was there, by the way, in the 1970s, there was a movement by politicians and rich people who wanted to put in a crematorium because the burning hats weren't enough for the entire population, and the Brahmins fought that hard.
Sure.
They said, even if you are a bricklayer and have anything to do with that crematorium, we will not cremate you. Now, the reason that I'm telling you this story is to point out that the Brahmins have historically been enemies of the teaching of the Buddha, and that in fact they got in league in the, let us say the 9th through the 12th century, and Buddhism was absolutely destroyed, wiped out. The story is that between 80 and 100 million people were killed. The land of and the other universities were destroyed and razed to the ground.
Hmm.
And that a number of people fled. That in fact that was the major spread of Buddhism into South Asia, Southeast Asia, etc., was because they were driven out. And so the next point that I'd like to make on this is that during those times and even before, they would try to fight the teaching of the Buddha by introducing their own belief systems into Buddhism. This is why rebirth and reincarnation is so strongly as part of the population, was because, for one thing, all of the Southeast Asian countries had already had animistic beliefs. Even in Thailand, there's still remnants of that, with spirit houses and putting monks' robes around trees because trees have spirits and this kind of stuff. And so the general populations have not been taught the way that in the early days, that the actual teachings of the Buddha in the very early days was widespread, but it became polluted intentionally. That in fact, one of the big events that happened is that in the time of King Asok, or Emperor Asok, which he was the one who came right after Alexander the Great was invading India, and the Indians fought him off, and that the father of King Asok was the one who became a warrior and an emperor and all of that. And so when King Asok came in, that was already in Malanda area, speaking the language of Magadhi. And he was the one who spread Buddhism widely in India. And it became let us say, a state religion then, to where he was building monasteries, he was building buildings, he was encouraging writing. He was also giving free robes and bowls, and every one of the Brahmin priests decided that it was better to become a Buddhist. Okay, now they were overwhelmed. There was not enough good teachers of the teaching of the Buddha to go around.
Right.
Imagine it like this. Imagine that you've got let us say, a large university, maybe 20,000 students, who has a faculty of maybe 1,000 or 2,000, and all of a sudden, the university is now stuck with 100,000 students, but it's got the same faculty.
Yeah.
What happens with that? The students start teaching each other what they know, rather than and that's what happened in the time of the Buddha. And this is one of the major pollution times of the teaching of the Buddha, was at that time. But even later, the Brahmins were trying to influence the teachings giving rise to documents like the Visuddhimagga and the
Mm.
Padisambhati Magga. Those kind of literature actually was, I think, designed to undermine the teaching of the Buddha. But the big one happened when the Brahmins were in league with the Moguls, the Islamic from Turkey, who came in. That's when they actually wiped them out.
Mm.
So the real teaching of Buddha actually over many, many centuries was driven underground because of enemies. All right. Now, go ahead.
Would you say that some scraps of truth did survive in this tradition and that tradition?
Well, driven underground, remember that there was a whole lot of monks underground.
Right.
Yes, that in fact the actual lineage has been preserved all of these centuries, passing down from teacher to student to teacher to student. That in fact, from my teacher, Bhikkhu Buddhadasa, I can trace it back to his teacher and his teacher's teacher, all the way back to 1860,
Mm.
and understanding the nobility of that line. That in fact, the royal family of Thailand, one of the reasons why the royal family of Thailand has been successful since the 1700s is because of their noble understanding of life.
Mm.
And that's why they're so highly regarded in Thailand, is because they were what Bhikkhu Buddhadasa would refer to as benign dictators.
Right.
Rather than greedy. They're actually assist and help the people. So now we can talk a little bit about the suttas in this regard. There are three different kinds of views. Two of them are worldviews, opinions, ideas, critical thinking, and that is the wrong view. And the wrong view is that there is no mother and father, there is no saints, there is no heavens and hells or afterlife or any of that thing, and therefore I can get away with it. It's basically the mob point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, the best example worldwide now would be Putin thinks that he can do anything he wants to and get away with it, and Trump is about the same way. But a lot of politicians, Republican governors, etc., like this. But it's a major viewpoint that, in fact, it's widespread in Christianity.
Mm.
Is that I can do what I want to do and get forgiveness from my God. And
Mm-hmm.
then I could go out and do it again.
Mm.
And because I've got forgiveness in advance, I can continue to harm people and still get into heaven. I won't get caught. So this is actually quite common. I would say, in fact, every human being has those kind of thoughts of, I can do wrong and get away with it.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have the more religious type that have what is referred to as an ordinary right view. And their ordinary right view is saying, oh, no, you can't get away with it. We're going to hire an army. We're going to have police. We're going to get the aunts and the uncles and grandmas and teachers to make sure that you behave yourself. We're going to spank you and administer punishments, etc., to make sure that you know that you can't get away with it.
Mm-hmm.
And if that doesn't work, then we're going to hire a priest who's going to send you to hell.
Mm-hmm.
Or the other side of that would be the karma machine.
Mm-hmm.
The karma machine is watching you. And if you put a beard and sunglasses on that karma machine and put him in the sky, then you've got a sky daddy that many people call God.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? But it's all just that same ordinary right view that's saying you can't get away with it. We've got rules and standards here.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the problem. All right? Because the Buddhist teaching is not a worldview. It is, in fact, an investigation. That it's not a noun, It's not a view, it's a verb, viewing, looking, investigating, seeing
Mhm.
what's going on, getting in touch with reality, by the way.
Mhm.
Well, what that does is that it overturns the right ordinary view. And they don't like that a little bit.
Yeah, I see.
Okay, so you can then say that the actual noble of the teachings of the Buddha are dangerous. They're dangerous for the person who is being taught, and they're dangerous for those who are listening in the peanut gallery.
I see.
Now, there is a sutra, by the way, number 22, that has this, the simile of the snake, with the idea that if you catch the Dhamma incorrectly, it's
Mhm.
going to bite you. And
Mhm.
that many people, when they begin to hear what the teachings of the Buddha are, they automatically will then fall into wrong view.
Right.
That the teaching has to be done correctly. That in fact, one of the statements is that it's good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good in the end when it is with right phrasing, meaning, and timing.
Yeah.
It has to be taught in a way so that the person is ready, because if they hear the actual teaching of the Buddha too soon, they will fall into wrong view,
Yeah. I see.
because they'll think that they can get away with anything.
I
And so
see.
we don't start with the teaching of heavens and hells be damned. We're working about right now. And so on the side, there are those who will hear this kind of teaching and says, whoa, we're trying to create a society here. We've got rules, you know. We want everybody to work for a living to support the royalty and the aristocracy and all the rich people. They need poor people to work.
Yeah.
And if people really understand the teaching of the Buddha, you're not going to get much out of them.
Right.
Okay? So, that in fact, a lot of them will join the Bhikkhu Sangha, and now they become dependent upon society as opposed to contribute to society. Um, and so there is that danger on both sides. Those who are learning the teaching of the Buddha and misapplying it and then fall into wrong view. And then there are those who are trying to build a society and don't like the teachings of the Buddha because it undermines their greed.
I see.
Okay, so this is why over time the teachings of the Buddha were driven underground,
Yeah.
but it didn't die out at all. Hence, the timing is that anyone can learn the Dhamma if they ask the right questions at the right time to the right person. For instance, they have to be asking these questions to a noble,
Yeah.
because if they ask the right questions at the right time to the wrong person, they're going to get a bunch of crap.
Right.
And if they're not asking the right questions at the right time, even to a noble, he's not going to give them the answer. This would be, in fact, the issue with Zen, is that the Zen masters are very careful about who they actually give the teachings to.
Mm.
So this is the story that I thought that you might be interested. That's what you were kind of asking, was
Yes.
uh, why this happens. And so um, we can continue out with the point that if you want to make this an interjection. Bhikkhu Buddhadasa, I don't know if you know any of the history of him, but he started teaching the Noble Dhamma in Thailand out in the open and got into a great deal of problems with it, that people ratted on him,
Yeah.
and the big heavy-duty monks in Bangkok put him on trial.
I've
The
heard you say
trial
that.
is actually called a Sangha Calls.
Yeah,
Well,
I've heard.
guess what? There were nobles in that Sangha there were actually senior monks who were not noble who were helped trying him. And in this trial, which took months to do, that actually invoked literature searches, because Bhikkhu Buddhadasa was making statements about the Pali that goes against the grain of the way that most monks are taught.
Yeah.
And so they did literature searches on a number of items, one of which was quite remarkable in the sense that Bhikkhu Buddhadasa said that the Buddha only taught one practice. I'm actually wanting to avoid using the word meditation, because we don't do meditation.
Right.
Our practice is not a meditation. Our practice is actually not a cogitation or a worry or trying to figure something out. We just set all of that aside and just be happy.
Yeah.
So he said that this was the only teaching that the Buddha gave was Anapanasati. Well, you know that in the Visuddhimagga there's 40 different meditations, much of which was taken out of the Satipatthana Sutta about the charnel grounds, and then there's the jhanas, and then there's the Brahma Viharas, and a whole lot of stuff that they collected. But this was done by Brahmins. They were ordained as Buddhist monks, but their mentality was that of Brahmanism.
Right.
So Bhikkhu Buddhadasa then in this trial made some noble friends. And in fact, one of them, the Samdet Sankaraj, his name was Buddhadasa, took Bhikkhu Buddhadasa as a student, and they had a student-teacher relationship for many years until Buddhadasa died in about 1950.
Mm.
And that this is the point that I'm making is that Bhikkhu Buddhadasa had the opinion that now in the 20th century, it's safe enough, it's time enough to let the real noble teachings out.
See.
So Bhikkhu Buddhadasa was also quite devoted to the Thai community, to where Ajahn Po, who was a lifelong friend of Bhikkhu Buddhadasa, and was the abbot. In fact, he became abbot in 1969. He's 93 years old and lives very close to me here. And so Ajahn Po was the one who became extremely oriented towards spreading Buddhism to the rest of the world, spreading it to the Western world in particular. And so this is where I come in, is that we've only got a few Westerners who really understood the teachings of Bhikkhu Buddhadasa and the teachings of the Buddha. And so we're bringing this out to the West because it's time. For centuries, the teachings of the Buddha have been quiet, held back, not spread out because of the dangers. I mean, kings and Brahmins and religious people. Here's an example of what I mean. Christianity really hates atheists, but atheists are off on the wrong foot. That in fact, the big conflict between Christianity and atheism is the question, is there a God? Does God actually exist? And actually, neither one of them understand what they're talking about. They don't, in fact, ever bother to define the word God so that they can truly figure out what it is that they're conflict about. But the real teachings of the Buddha does not, in fact, have a war with Christianity. We just wipe them out immediately. Just, they're gone. And they don't like that at all. It just completely annihilates Christianity. Now, one of the things that I will mention on that is that the teachings of Jesus, both by understanding it and also by understanding Bhikkhu Buddhadasa's point, that the teachings of Jesus were noble.
Yeah.
Sermon on the Mount is noble teachings. Christianity, however, has nothing to do with the teachings of Jesus and everything to do about painting him gold and putting him on his cross. In fact, the joke is that the Catholics keep putting him on the cross, and the Protestants come by with their hammers and pull the nails out, and Jesus starts to float up in the sky. And before he gets out of the way too much, the Catholics will grab him by one of those broken feet, pull him back down, and nail him back up to the cross. But both of
Right.
them are missing the point.
But statements like the kingdom of God is within you, or take no thought for the morrow. I mean, these are, I consider them to be noble teachings. You know, they're very in line with the practice that I've learned from you.
Right. And not only that, but there is fairly clear evidence that Jesus did have a practice, and that is that the story about Gethsemane, the night before he was, or actually, he was taken prisoner early in the morning. But the night before he was taken prisoner, he kept saying, "Can't you guys keep watch with me?"
Yeah.
Wow. If you understand what they mean by "can't you do Vipassana? Can't you stay awake? Can't you see what's going on? Can you watch? Can you stay on watch?" That's in fact what we're doing, is we're learning to watch the mind, to guard the mind, and yet his disciples would go to sleep on him.
And when he says, when Satan comes in the desert and tempts him, and he says, "Get thee hence, Satan," I think about, "I see you, Mara," or just chucking out unwholesome thoughts immediately. Don't give them the time of day. So I see similar patterns in his life as well. But that's what I love about.
That actually raises the question: well, where did Jesus get his material?
Who knows?
Well, that's the actual correct answer, is that we don't know that. But I did ask that question to Bhikkhu Buddhadasa, and we had a speculation about it, that it was quite possible that, in fact, we know that Buddhism has been spread by Asok into the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
There is a group in Alexandria that were quite famous in those days. The Tabastians, I think, is what they were called. But it's actually, Thera gives us the word therapy. But it actually comes from Theravada, the teaching of the elders. And that the teachings of the Buddha were widespread, and Essenes, or the Essenes, depending upon how you say it, behaved exactly the way, even to the point of their ritual bathing, because that's something that was done in the time of the Buddha, that the monks would take a bath together before the Patimokkha. And so there's too many similarities in there for to say, oh, we don't have an idea, maybe Jesus made that stuff up and all this kind of stuff. But the idea that no, the noble teachings were already available, and that Jesus could have found those noble teachings and been schooled, because we don't know what happened in his childhood.
I also love that we don't need to know. I mean, there's that one sutta, I don't remember the number, but somebody is asking the Buddha, "Do you believe in this? And do you believe in that?" And the Buddha keeps saying, "Well, no, and no, and no, and no." And the person says, how can you not hold any of these beliefs? And he says, "Because this is a thicket of views, and it just leads to despair and suffering." And I really love that phrase, thicket of views. It doesn't require, as you say, cogitation, philosophy, metaphysics. It's simply, can I be satisfied right now? And when I ask myself that question, the answer always seems to be yes. I mean, it's so remarkable. It's so remarkable that I lived a whole life without people teaching me to notice how often I was satisfied, because I think I have been satisfied so often, but without being aware of that, it just always goes under the radar. But to actually notice, wait, now I'm satisfied, and now I'm satisfied, and now I'm satisfied. And if I feel stressed or overwhelmed, I can just take a breath and say, well, actually, this moment is okay too. And it's just,
well, that's actually the entire teaching of the Buddha right there.
It's so
that's all he taught. He didn't teach metaphysics. He didn't teach magical powers. He didn't teach rebirth and reincarnation or any of that kind of stuff. what he taught and is known to have taught was dukkha, dukkha, nirodha.
Yeah.
And that if we define dukkha correctly, then in fact in the suttas, one of the points is putting up with things that are hard to endure, but the most important one is wanting things we don't have.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's being dissatisfied. And
Absolutely.
so the word satisfaction actually is the word in Pali is sukha. Now in Thai language, duk and sukh are exact opposites.
Mm.
I've also heard that in the Gujarati language, duki and sukhi are exact opposites. So if you're in a state of satisfaction, you've already fulfilled the teachings of the Buddha.
That's why I love the word satisfaction so much more than enlightenment, because enlightenment just seems so abstract and
Way out there and hard to define, and up there with Jesus on a high shelf or maybe
exactly.
out in the sky.
Exactly, but I feel satisfied.
Enlightenment has floated off into the air and we weren't able to grab it by the foot and bring it back down and nail it up again.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So can
That in
I,
fact, the word enlightenment is really misused anyway. It should not be applied to Buddhism. The word enlightenment was actually part of the French Revolution. A lot of the age of enlightenment was war, was conflict. And that basically what we could say was the age of enlightenment is when science and reality begin to have a foothold in society and religion lost its place. That in fact that's what's been happening. We're still in the age of enlightenment because Christianity and Islam are actually falling apart.
hmm,
Judaism is basically already fallen apart. There's only a few Hasidics and ultra Orthodox and conservatives left. Most of them have um, turned Judaism from a religion into a culture.
right.
Also, Christianity has turned morally from a religion into culture. In fact, a political party.
Right. But
So,
I love your spin on enlightenment as kind of lighten up. Just lighten up. I think that's a great kind of modern translation. It's much more
yes,
helpful.
well, that's exactly what it means.
Yeah.
That's what the word enlightenment means. That's why I don't mind using it, is because it's an easy word to reframe.
Yeah. So I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I have one more question maybe about um Anapanasati itself. I've heard you use the metaphor of base camp, kind of I don't know if you describe the first jhana as base camp, but spending as much time on establishing base camp as possible, getting used to that altitude, getting your lungs acclimated, just sitting in that state of satisfaction over and over and over again as often as you can
Yes,
remember to do it.
right, because we're not going to spend a whole lot of time at the peak.
Right. And I
You're not
love,
going to spend the night on the peak because it's cold, how you'll freeze to death.
and I noticed
It,
that I mean, even kind of wanting the peak causes dukkha, so I don't even think about
yes.
climbing the peak. I
Hmm.
just, I'm
Well,
totally
that's what the
satisfied.
Westerners are all about. They're trying to get to that peak.
Right. So it,
And if they get it one time or they get a feeling, now they want it again. They are actually very much experience oriented. And I can see where that's part of the culture. That in fact, it may in fact have been influenced by the Christian idea about baptism. That
mm,
once you're baptized, you're in. Okay, and the Buddhist idea is that once you've had a peak experience, you're in.
I see. Right. Okay.
And yet we know for sure that Christians can get baptized on Sunday evening and go shoot people on Tuesday.
Yes, unfortunately, that's correct. But all you need to do is just take another breath and be reborn in the next moment. I mean, this is all we
Yeah,
have.
to be never mind, start again, be reborn again, over and over again. That in fact, it's repetition. So
So,
anyway, you were forming a question.
well, I've been reading, I don't know if you consider this a helpful book, Buddhadasa's book. It's just called Anapanasati, Mindfulness of Breathing. I think it's a pretty old book. It's about 500 pages. I know he has several books. I don't know if you know the one I mean.
Actually, I know of four. There were four different, uh, let us say, talks, groups, that he would talk for a few days on Anapanasati, and he would go through it in the order that it was expected, and that it was actually translated into English four different times.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Uh, and that you can tell the difference is that he began to make some changes over time. That
Oh,
in fact, in the early days, he was very much into the Sudimagga, as all the monks were. In the 1950s, he knew the noble Dhamma, but he was evolving with that. And then in the last thing that I have noticed was that he still, even in his late age, was talking about the nose tip.
yeah. Okay. So this leads me to my question. So, I love that I don't really separate formal practice from just my daily life. I think
Well,
any
it
monk,
never did.
that's right.
Formal practice is an invention. In fact, you could say that it was invented in the 1950s in Burma.
Right. But when I choose to sit down for 10 minutes and dedicate those 10 minutes to feeling satisfied, feeling as satisfied as I can, and just enjoying the breath, I notice that you don't spend a lot of time with students talking about counting the breath. Is counting the breath, is that something I need to bother thinking about? Does that matter?
Well, it does have some value in the sense that if you were watching your breath and making it long and counting it out long, at least you're not planning on your next party
Yeah. Yeah.
or planning on your next crime,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
But counting by itself is not particularly wholesome.
Why is that?
Well, it's kind of blue, and people will lose track of it. Now,
Yeah.
the value of the counting is to get you into a rhythm of breathing in long and breathing out long, to change your rhythm pattern, because ordinary breathing is shallow. You probably heard it mentioned. The doctors have been doing research about this for many centuries, and they know about what is a blood rate, blood pulse rate of 72 for women and 52 or back and like that, and also the breathing rate is at 20. Well, we're going to be taking the breathing rate down to 5 or 6 breaths a minute to make it at least 4 times as slow,
Yeah.
or a quarter of the speed, to begin to slow it down. And that 5 or 6 breaths a minute is fine. 3 breaths a minute takes experience, and that there's an awful lot of people, let us say divers and swimmers, who try to be able to hold their breath for long periods of time. Also, musicians.
Right.
How long can you hold a note?
Yeah.
Okay. And that this is actually not sustainable. The trumpet player cannot pick up his trumpet, take a deep breath, and hold a note for 45 seconds to a minute, and then do that again and again and again and again and again. He'll go really tired.
Yeah.
Okay. What we're looking for is something that can be sustained
Right.
and keep doing it over and over again. This is why we're looking at 4, 5, 6 breaths a minute. So it's much, much slower than ordinary, but it's not down to the extreme of 3 or 2 or 1 breaths per minute.
Okay. And
Okay.
so I
That
I don't know.
everything about the teaching of the Buddha is middle path.
Yes, that's
Everything is middle path, even our rate of breathing.
yeah.
So we can use the counting to help us get into a rhythm of long, deep in breaths, and then we can remember to sustain that. In fact, this is a big part of the practice, is to use your breathing to help you build up the skill of sati. that if you're remembering to breathe in long and remembering to breathe out long, you can also remember to look at what you're thinking while you're doing that. And if the mind wanders away from the breath, never mind, just come back to the breath and come back to the wholesome thoughts. And so using the breath, that's why Buddha recommended Anapanasati as the only practice, because it has the body, it has the feelings, it has the mind's objects and the mind states, especially the mind state, that we have to change our attitude from being a victim of reality, of, oh, poor me, look what they did to me, into, I'm the winner here, I'm the champion. Big change of attitude.
I know. If you had told me a year ago that I had the power to change my attitude in that way, I wouldn't have believed you, but it's so true. I can't believe how I won't say easy, but simple. I mean, it's just very clear to me that we do have that power to
Yeah.
choose to feel
Do
like a
you
lion.
know much about classical music?
I mean, I'm a fan. I listen. I don't play.
Okay. Rachmaninoff's piano concerto, the very famous one, is easy. But you got to practice and practice and practice and practice and
Yeah.
practice.
Yeah. But the thing about the practice is that it's so enjoyable.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't
Well,
feel,
making music is also enjoyable
yeah.
for some, but most people who take piano lessons, they don't wind up being on stage.
That's too bad. I mean, it can be enjoyable for everyone, don't you think? It could be.
Well, if it's taught correctly,
Yeah.
even piano, I mean, in fact, to be honest with you, we have far fewer musicians nowadays than we had 100 years ago. Why? Because the stereo equipment in the house was actually an upright piano.
Yeah. Yeah.
We didn't have television, we didn't have radio, we didn't have all of that kind of stuff. And so music was the entertainment of the day. And so many people learned to play. It was part of the culture. Now that radio, television, and recorded music, especially digitized now, and only a few become musicians. Kids would rather listen to music without having to learn to play it.
Mm.
And so the analogy that I use about learning to play music and the repetitive nature of having to do it over and over again, and the fact that students will quit
Yeah.
because they're not enjoying their practice,
Exactly.
happens also with meditation. That the Mahasi method is not particularly enjoyable. It's not good in the beginning, and it's certainly not good in the middle. They call it the dark night of the soul. Ha ha.
Yeah. Well, you've sure taught me how to enjoy my practice, so I thank you tremendously for that. I'll let
Well,
you go.
Michael, it's good to meet you, and I'm really happy to be a friend of yours. Join us in the Sangha, join our calls,
I will.
and call me when you want to. When you have a question, you can ask it on the Sangha calls, or you can ask me, you can call me.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being available like this. It means so much.
Good luck with your practice.
Thank
Keep
you.
at it. Don't let it lapse.
No, no, I don't think I will. Thank you so much.
All right. We'll see you.
Goodbye.